Okay, so today we're going to cover restoration. And we've talked a lot about restoration as it relates to coastal marshes in Louisiana. But we haven't really talked about restoration anywhere else, nor have we talked about restoration ecology, and so that's what we're going to cover today. So, let's get started. So today we're going to understand the 4 R's of restoration, and these are remediation, reclamation, rehabilitation, and of course restoration. So we'll understand the differences between these. And we'll see a couple of different examples in relaxation. That's what you do after things are restored. Then you can go and relax on the beach. We'll go over examples of rehabilitation and restoration from different locations outside of the Gulf of Mexico. And then you have an activity to look at coral restoration. And then finally, we'll talk about jobs in restoration, so environmental consultant jobs. Speaking of which, if you look up environmental consultant stock photos, you're going to have endless entertainment. They're very, very funny. So I've included a couple of those in this lecture. So the learning goals for today are to understand that remediation, reclamation, rehabilitation, and restoration are all terms referring to activities that attempt to alter and improve the biological and physical conditions at a degraded site. You'll learn that both restoration and rehabilitation can produce a system with a high degree of ecological integrity, but the difference is that restoration attempts to restore what was previously there, including the original species, whereas rehabilitation doesn't necessarily do that. And then you'll learn about environmental consultants and how they can provide an analysis and insight on environmental concerns for public and private industries. And this includes weighing in on property acquisition, development and construction, public works and infrastructure, health compliance, safety, sustainability, energy efficiency. So a lot of these have to do with restoration type projects, and so that's why environmental consultants appear in this lecture, though of course they can have a hand in a variety of other things that we've talked about in this course. Okay, so the 4 R's. Sometimes you'll see these as the 3 R's. Sometimes remediation is not included, but I like to talk about remediation as well as part of this process. So the 4 R's are remediation, reclamation, rehabilitation, and restoration. And each one of these has their own separate slide, so I will define these for you. And these are all terms referring to activities that attempt to alter and improve the biological and physical conditions at a site that's degraded. And so, for instance, here you have a natural ecosystem that experiences some sort of degradation or disturbance, such as mining. And you can have remediation, which cleans up any sort of pollution. We'll talk about that. But the other 3 R's are restoration, where we restore something similar to the natural conditions. Rehabilitation, which you can see doesn't really look quite like the natural ecosystem, but it looks like it's functioning. And replacement, where we put something else entirely there, such as like a lake. All these terms are closely linked, but they refer to distinct phases in the process of ecological recovery, and even different endpoints. So you can see each of these endpoints is quite different. So practice independently, you'll get different endpoints, but you can do these activities in sequence. So for instance, you might want to take a disturbance and do some rehabilitation and use this land for something else, and then eventually work towards a full restoration. So that's a possibility too. Whenever these activities are taking place, you definitely want to have some clear end goals and objectives for the project in mind, because depending on the objective, you may decide to go a different route. Perhaps replacement is a better route for you if you want to use this activity for tourism, as opposed to restoration, where you might want to do restoration if you want to, for instance, increase the number of species that are in the area. So let's talk about each of these in their own kind of separate treatment. So remediation. Remediation means the cleanup of a contaminated area. We talked about oil spills, oil spill cleanup responses. Those would be examples of remediation. So here you can see people in hazmat suits that are cleaning up an oil spill. Remedial impacts or actions remove or isolate contaminants from the environment, so you're cleaning up the environmental contaminants. It's an important step that must happen before restoration can happen. And so if you have any sort of contaminants, you can't have restoration without first having remediation. And you can have specific performance measures that help you address if your goal has been achieved. And these can be like these 3 points here. So you can have major sources of contamination in the watershed have been reduced or eliminated. You can have toxin concentrations in the water and sediment no longer exceed levels known to be dangerous for life. Or you could even have those pollutants remain in the system, but they're buried below stream banks or in floodplain sediments that have been stabilized by vegetation. And so they're buried and semi-permanently buried in the sediments, and they're not available for life. Reclamation involves the stabilization of terrain, the improvement in landscape appearance and aesthetics, and the return of land to some use. And so this involves essentially getting that land away from an erosion type state and transforming it into something that is useful generally for people. But it can also have some sort of ecosystem functions. Another word for this is replacement. And so if you see the word replacement, for instance, on this diagram here, we're talking about the same concept of reclamation. Typically, when you do reclamation, you're only planting a few types of plant species that are mainly used for stabilization of the soil. You're not really going back to what was originally there. And you're really not interested, if you're doing reclamation, you're not really interested necessarily in restoring the ecological value of an area. Instead, you're trying to prevent that area essentially from eroding away and not restoring. You are providing some sort of value, human value to the area. So one example of a reclamation type activity is the creation of bench terraces, which are a soil and water conservation measure that can be used on sloping land with relatively deep soils. And these can help that land retain water and control erosion. So we've learned about the word terracing when it's related to marsh restoration, where you build little long islands that will slow the flow of water and help to enhance sedimentation. This is not the same kind of terracing. This is bench terracing, where you're creating what really looks like a series of benches on a slope. So what these benches do is they can allow the water to stick around for a little while and infiltrate into the soil. And that's why this works best in an area where you have a lot of soil or deep soil, because you have a lot of room for infiltration of the water. The water will kind of percolate down and flow down kind of in a non-linear path, which helps to prevent further erosion of these terraces. And then in terms of the use, not only are we creating a use of water infiltration and storage, but these can also be used for farming. So here's an example of a series of terraces that's being used to farm. I believe in this case, this looks like wheat to me. But a lot of tea is farmed in this way. A lot of crops can be farmed on these terraces. And this creates farmland out of a slope that would be a mudslide risk and not usable at all for farming. So it's creating a new use out of the area. Rehabilitation is meant to repair and replace the essential or primary ecosystem services and functions which had been altered or eliminated by a disturbance. And so here you're interested in recreating the function of the ecosystem and any sort of services it had for people, the original services, so not new services like, for instance, converting something to farmland. So rehabilitation restores functions and services, but it does not emphasize the establishment of what was previously there. So you don't necessarily establish pre-existing species or pre-existing diversity. Instead, you're going to say, okay, what service did this land provide to people? What function did it have for the ecosystem as a whole? Let's restore those functions and services. So an example would be, and we'll see this project in a later slide, but this project in China to restore a coastal environment, they didn't reproduce natural conditions. They actually added in these islands in a lake. And the idea was to create something that was aesthetically pleasing, so it's really pretty to look at, but also to increase habitat for nesting birds. And so they were trying to restore the function of this lake by adding something new. This doesn't really look like what it once was, but it still has the same function that it once had. Rehabilitation might be necessary or ideal in some cases where restoring the original species community is nearly impossible. So that can be the case if, for instance, a species has gone extinct, and so some species that you needed to restore the native community is gone, or for whatever reason that species can no longer grow there, like for instance because of climate change. And so if you're trying to restore a community that has been phased out by warming temperatures or will be phased out in the near future, you probably can't restore the original community. So you're going to restore something that's similar, and that's a reasonable option. If you have rehabilitation that's based on ecological principles, so it's got some sort of goal that's ecological in mind, like for instance in this picture, restoring nesting habitat, what you can do with rehabilitation is have a very quick or relatively quick restoration of the functions of that habitat. So for instance, in this case, by building these islands, they have bird habitat that's built in maybe one season of construction in the spring. Whereas if they had waited around for a lot of this coastal area to kind of figure itself out after this restoration and become good bird habitat, figure out where the people were going to go, so the birds could figure out some quiet habitat to nest, that would take a lot longer to bring the birds back. Here they've created nice quiet habitat for birds to nest, which can bring them back faster. So it's kind of like speeding up restoration of ecosystem services and functions. And finally, we have restoration. So restoration is the process of returning an ecosystem to what it previously was. So you're going to return it to some sort of historical or baseline condition prior to the disturbances that you know of. That means that you need to know something about its historical or baseline condition, which sometimes is pretty hard because disturbance in many systems happened, even in some cases in pre-European colonial times. So these are times that we don't really have a great approximation of what the system looked like. We don't really know. So we have to do our best. In some cases, we do have a really good baseline. Like we can have scientific information about what a system looked like before mining or before dredging. And so that would be great because then we could restore it to what that system looked like. It's important in restoration to be realistic. So an injured ecosystem may never return to conditions identical to those of the past. You're never going to get something that's exactly the same. You can do a pretty good job. As I mentioned before, sometimes species are not ideal for that ecosystem anymore because of climate change or some other reason. And so you might have to rely more on some other species that existed there previously, and that's okay. So you have to be realistic. And it's important to note that even though restoration is like the gold star in terms of dealing with environmental degradation, both restoration and rehabilitation can really produce a system with a high degree of ecological integrity. The difference being that restoration attempts to restore in pretty exact detail what was previously there, including the original species, while rehabilitation is really just trying to trying to restore the function of the ecosystem beforehand, and doesn't necessarily rely on the exact species or the exact way the land was formed before. So in an example of restoration, in Santa Monica, there's a beach restoration project going on, and this project involves planting and protecting a variety of native plant species. They want to get their native plant biodiversity back. And so these plant species may not serve a specific role that's any different from any other marsh grass, but they are a unique component of the biodiversity in the area. And that may be really important to people that are living there. They may want to say like, oh, this beach has all of these beautiful flowers. These are our native flowers. We're restoring the biodiversity. And it also may be really good for instance, some pollinators or some insects and maybe even some birds that rely on these habitats. So by including these habitats, they're taking extra steps to restore the system to what it previously was. Plus they're beautiful. And cute little beach flowers. All right, let's do a quiz. Hopefully Top Hat will work. I made it a quick quiz, just a true-false question. So true or false? Both rehabilitation and restoration can produce a system with a high degree of ecological integrity. True. This is a true statement. Excellent job. You guys did a great job on this. So both rehabilitation and restoration are really great for restoring ecological integrity. Restoration focuses on the native species, rehabilitation not necessarily. But both restore ecosystem functions and services. So that is true. Okay, so let's do a couple of examples of rehabilitation and restoration projects. So the first example I have is a rehabilitation example. And this is from Qinhuangdao Beach in North China. It's located along a shoreline of a sea, the Bohai Sea, but it's also located on the outskirts of a city. And so this is an area that stands to be highly used and abused by people, and it turns out that's exactly what happened. So the whole site was in an environmentally and ecologically damaged condition. The dunes were heavily eroded, the vegetation was pretty much gone, and the beach was deserted and littered, and people just didn't care about it. They didn't use it. It was gross. They didn't care about it, which contributed to its decline. The reason for its initial decline was, some problems with coastal development. So previous unwise development tactics had destroyed the wetland, left it full of debris, and then just things kind of cascaded from there. Misuse and abuse. So what the city decided to do was a rehabilitation project. And so in this case, they used various design techniques. They really engineered this system to achieve some goals. And they wanted to make sure that the beach was ecologically recovered and also beautiful to look at. And so this is an image here, an artist's rendering of what they were trying to do with this system. And so you can see all of the developments along here. So they extended the beach out. They included marsh with lots of different tide pools. And they restored a lake over here with a bunch of islands in it. And you can see here there are even birds in this picture because birds played a major role in their decisions to design this habitat in this way. There's also a coastal boardwalk to allow people to take in the natural beauty and to access this point. So that way, the idea is that if more people care about it, they'll take better care of it and it won't become a garbage dump in the future. So they wanted to unveil to tourists and local residents how beautiful this site could be and transform this degraded beach into an ecologically healthy landscape, focusing on birds. This example is a representation of what restoration can achieve. So this is full restoration to previous conditions. And this is an example from seagrass restoration. And it's actually the world's largest seagrass restoration project by far, and it occurs not too far from here on the eastern shore of Virginia. This area has a lot of relatively undisturbed coastal bays. It's very much like the Outer Banks of North Carolina, if any of you have ever been there. It's very similar, but it's even less visited than that. There aren't very many people that live out there. And the area used to have expansive seagrass beds and all sorts of animals that use seagrass, like sea turtles, bay scallops, seahorses. But this ecosystem was lost between 1930s and 1980s. I mean, completely lost. Like, there wasn't a strand of seagrass to be found anywhere. So folks were wondering, this area has nice clear water, it's beautiful, it's the right temperature, there's nobody here doing construction, why is there no seagrass here? And so researchers went out to take a look, and it turns out the system was actually perfect for seagrass, but there was no supply of seeds. So at some point, something had wiped out the seagrasses, maybe a storm or disease, and it left no supply of seed in the area. And so what they decided to do was plant native seagrass seeds, and it's essentially the seagrass spread out of control. And so now the restored seagrass covers almost 15 square miles, and that whole system has been restored to its previous state, including they've also reintroduced a variety of species that depend on the seagrass, such as bay scallops, which are pictured here. So they actually took bay scallops and hatched them and grew them up to like a small little scallop size, and then spread them out in the seagrass, and they're doing great. They're growing like gangbusters out there. And also a variety of species that depend on seagrass came back, such as seahorses. And so I know they're so cute. So we have 15 miles of restored seagrass. That's miles and miles more than you can find anywhere in any other restoration project around the world. And it's because folks had realistic expectations for this system, figured out what the root problem was, and that problem wasn't completely, unachievable to solve. So spreading around seed is so much easier than, for instance, what Kinhung Dao Beach did in terms of cleaning out all that rubble and restoring that system. This is a relatively easy restoration. I still haven't been out there to snorkel. I bet it would be just amazing to snorkel in there. There's lots of sea turtles and everything in there now. It'd be beautiful. There's your relaxation. Post-restoration relaxation. Did you really? Oh, that's so cool. Yeah, class trip to Virginia. Oh, I really wish we could go. That'd be lovely. Honestly, we could probably get the same experience going out to the Chandeleur Islands. That would be really fun. But that's really cool. You got a couple baby turtles at the lake. That lake is kind of like gross to swim in and stuff, but ecologically, it does a lot of good. There's a lot of species that use that. I don't know if you guys have ever seen there is a massive migration of the big white pelicans through this area I guess it must happen in the fall, because that's the last time I noticed they were out there. But the lakes are actually a resting spot for those pelicans. They'll come in there and they'll hang out for a long period of time. If any of you live close to the lakes, you probably know this is happening because they're very loud. Yep, right. So they're stopping over on their migrations, which is pretty cool because those are man-made lakes. They're not natural lakes. So it's cool that they serve a purpose like that. All right, so this is the point in the lecture where I show you some environmental consultant stock photos. So funny. That bottom one just kills me. All right, so I wanted to let you guys know, because a lot of you have majors that are really, really useful for environmental consulting. So I wanted to let you know about this career path in case you don't already know about it. So environmental consultants do the analysis and a lot of research and policy kinds of fields, environmental fields. They do all of this research for public industries or public groups. Like, for instance, you can be a consultant for a city or for a parish, or for private industries. So, for instance, you could be a consultant for a construction industry or the oil industry. And you would be providing advice on property acquisition and development, any sort of city works or infrastructure kinds of things going on, any sort of issues with health, compliance, and safety. So, for instance, if there was a spill that needed to be cleaned up, a lot of consultants will come in and try and figure out the best way to do that. Sustainability and energy efficiency. Some folks might be more interested in developing, some green aspects to a company, and so they might bring in a consultant for that. So really they're helping both private and public sector clients address environmental issues and lower environmental impact in areas that are experiencing things like water pollution, excess waste, any sort of water management, air quality, soil contamination. All of these things that we have so much of along the Gulf Coast and really in coastal environments around the world. And so there's a massive need for environmental consultants. And there's a lot of need for environmental consultants in this region because we're doing so many restoration projects here. And so there are groups here that are always hiring these types of folks. If you wanted to stay in the area and you have the right kind of background for this, this might be a field for you. Plus, you can look this cool at work. Can you imagine? So examples of environmental consultants, the types of backgrounds that you might need are landscape architecture, geospatial analysis. This would be like your GIS folks, civil engineers, geotechnical engineers, which are a type of civil engineer that deal with earth materials like rock and soil. Environmental scientists, any sort of environmental scientists, biologists, chemists, physical oceanographers, geological oceanographers, all of these. Or environmental attorneys. There's a lot of public policy and environmental policy that goes into these types of decisions. So attorneys are often included in a consultant team. And a team of these individuals with different backgrounds will work together to solve these issues. And so you don't have to have experience in all of these, but if you do have an interest in at least some of these, you might want to consider working as an environmental consultant. It's a cool job. Okay, so I do have an activity for you under week 14-23 in class, which is a virtual scuba dive activity, which I think you guys are going to love. It's not incredibly structured. I really just kind of want you guys to explore. And there are a couple of sites that I'll send you to that where active reef restoration is taking place. So I want you to kind of see what folks are doing to restore these reefs. You don't have to know too much in terms of like the technical explanation for a lot of these things, but I just want you to see what this looks like. So go ahead and do this activity, and that'll be the end of class today. So answer those questions and you'll be good to go. All right, it's 11:20, so that's the end of class. Hopefully you guys got to go on some cool dives. And next class on Wednesday is on pollution. And then on Friday we're going to have an in-class work session for your final project. And your current event number 3 is due on Friday. So please make sure that you are thinking about that this week, as well as your final project. Again, I'm not going to have any additional homeworks this week. You can still work on, I believe you can still work on at least one of the homeworks from the readings from last week. And if you need any more time on any of these homeworks, just let me know.